Containment breach in Medbay 4. I repeat, containment breach. The warning crackled over the ship's internal comms, jagged with interference, before cutting out altogether. Commander Dain Voss strode through the dimly lit corridor of Solace, his every step pounding against the reinforced flooring like a war drum. He was already moving before the call finished, boots striking metal in sync with the distant blare of emergency klaxons. A hospital ship was supposed to be a sanctuary, but right now, Solace felt like a steel coffin. "Status," he barked, barely glancing at Lieutenant Arden Hale, his security chief, who fell into step beside him. "All access points to Medbay 4 are on lockdown, but we lost internal feeds 30 seconds before the breach. Crew logs indicate 5 personnel inside. Only 1 responded to a roll call." Hale's voice was a clipped growl, a man shaped by the kind of battles fought in close corridors and blood-slicked decks. "The others? No word. Bioscanners are offline." Voss exhaled sharply through his nose. A simple relief mission, they'd said. A diplomatic gesture, a sign of goodwill. And yet here they were, barely an hour into Varak territory, and already the ship was turning against them. His heads-up display flickered as he strode forward, a faint overlay of ship schematics mapping out the shortest route to Medbay 4. They turned a sharp corner, where 2 security officers were manually overriding the bulkhead door. "Seal's been compromised," one of them muttered, sweat slicking his brow. "Command override isn't working. The system keeps rejecting our clearance." Voss didn't wait. "We do this the hard way, then. Override on my mark. Hale, take point." The lieutenant lifted his weapon, a compact plasma rifle modified for shipboard combat. In confined spaces, every stray shot could mean the difference between survival and explosive decompression. 3, 2, 1. Move. The doors hissed apart, revealing a scene of quiet devastation. The medbay was dim, emergency lighting pulsing red like the slow, methodical heartbeat of something wounded. A sharp, metallic tang hung in the air, undercut by the sickly sweet smell of sterilizing agents, failing to mask something far worse. A body lay sprawled across the floor, a widening pool of crimson seeping into the pristine white tiles. Voss knelt, gloved fingers brushing against the insignia on the man's uniform. Dr. Ronan Kessler, head of xenomedicine. Throat slashed, the wound ragged, uneven, as if the blade had hesitated, or the killer had. "Sir?" Hale muttered, nodding toward the far end of the room. A faint shuffling, the barest hitch of breath. Voss rose in one fluid motion, weapon already drawn. "Identify yourself!" A figure staggered into view from behind a toppled med station, hands raised, eyes wide and glassy with shock. "Rook," Hale muttered under his breath. "Assistant medtech, green as they come." He... Rook's voice cracked, hoarse and shaking. His uniform was smeared with blood, none of it his own. It wasn't supposed to..." Voss didn't lower his weapon. "What happened?" Rook's breath stuttered, his whole frame trembling. I don't... Look at me." The quiet steel in Voss's voice cut through the panic, and Rook obeyed, his wide-eyed gaze locking onto the commander. Voss saw it immediately, the kind of fear that wasn't just reactionary, but weighted, heavy with knowledge. "You saw something," he pressed, voice even. Rook swallowed hard, his gaze flickered, not to Voss, but past him. Hale moved on instinct. In a blur, he swung around, just as a dark shape lunged from the shadows. The attacker moved fast, too fast. Hale's plasma rifle discharged, a blinding pulse of white-blue light slicing through the dark. The bolt struck home, searing through the assailant's torso. The impact sent him sprawling, but something was wrong. There was no scream, no sound at all. Voss advanced, gun trained on the fallen figure. The body twitched, then stilled. The scent of burnt fabric and scorched flesh curled through the medbay, but even before Voss reached him, he knew. The corpse was human. The Solace's medical insignia still adorned the uniform, a jagged hole burned clean through the chest. Voss had fought enough battles to recognize death when he saw it, and yet Hale was already moving, flipping the body over. The moment he did, his breath hitched. Sir. Voss looked and felt something cold unfurl in his gut. The man's face was wrong. His features were human, technically. But something about them didn't sit right. The skin looked too tight, the eyes slightly too large, the bones beneath the flesh subtly off. Then the body twitched. The corpse twitched. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then it lashed out. Hale barely had time to react before the thing's fingers, joints, shifting unnaturally, almost like a puppet on broken strings, clamped around his throat. The lieutenant choked, struggling against the inhuman grip. Voss didn't hesitate. A single shot, right between the eyes. The thing jerked once, fingers spasming, then went limp, a thick, viscous liquid leaking from the wound. Hale shoved the body off him, gasping. What in the hell was that? Voss didn't answer. He knelt, brushing his fingers over the cooling skin. Too smooth, too uniform. The hair was slightly off-color near the roots, like a bad synthetic weave. Not a mask, not surgery, something else, something worse. His earpiece crackled suddenly. Voss. The voice was raw, tight with urgency. We have a problem. Dr. Malric Vane, the ship's chief medical officer. Voss pressed a hand to his comm. You're not the first to say that today. What's going on? A brief silence, then, someone accessed the ship's AI core. Voss's blood ran cold. The system rejected my clearance. Security logs have been wiped. Sir, I think we've been compromised. The lights flickered, just for a second. Then the overhead displays shut off completely. The ship's heartbeat stuttered. And for the first time since stepping foot aboard the Solace, Voss realized that the real threat wasn't outside. The ship's heartbeat stuttered. The overhead lights blinked once, then again, before fading into a dim emergency glow. Voss gritted his teeth. A dead man had just moved, the ship's AI was under attack, and their only doctor left breathing had just confirmed what he already suspected. This was more than sabotage. It was an invasion, and it had begun long before they arrived. He turned sharply to Hale, who was rubbing his throat where the impostor had nearly crushed his windpipe. The lieutenant's eyes were darker now, the flickering light catching something raw beneath his practiced control. Voss had seen that look before, on soldiers who had survived battles they never expected to fight. We're sealing off access to the AI core, Voss said, his voice cutting through the medbay's heavy silence. Nobody in or out except verified command personnel. Hale gave a sharp nod, pressing a hand to his comm. Engineering, this is Lieutenant Hale. Lockdown primary and auxiliary control hubs. No exceptions. A distorted crackle filtered through before a response came, static warped and laced with unease. Sir, we're trying, but something's looping clearance codes. The connection cut out. Voss's jaw tightened. We move now. Medbay is compromised. That means every other critical sector could be too. He shifted his attention to Rook, who stood like a man just barely holding himself together. Kid, he said, voice firm but measured, I need you to focus. What did you see before the attack? Rook licked his lips, swallowing down whatever was threatening to claw its way out of his throat. It was Kessler, he said, barely above a whisper. He came back early from the quarantine sector. Said he'd found something strange in the bio readings. Then the others started changing. Voss's pulse quickened. Changing how? Rook's hands twitched at his sides, like his body was reliving what his mind wasn't ready to process. They stopped moving for a while, like they were frozen. Then one of them, the one we... His voice faltered as he glanced at the body Hale had put down. He just stood up again. But it wasn't him anymore. Voss exhaled slowly. He knew what battlefields smelled like. He knew the scent of metal-splitting skin, the way blood dried too quickly in recycled air. But this wasn't war. This was something older, something more insidious. That means this started before we even docked, he said finally. They've been here. They were waiting for us. Hale's fingers flexed around his rifle. Then we stopped waiting. We pushed back. They moved swiftly through the ship's arteries, corridors stretching in either direction like veins, some still alive with flickering red emergency lights, others choked in darkness where power had been rerouted or severed entirely. The air was too still now. Solace was a city of steel and circuits, meant to house thousands, yet in that moment, it felt empty, or worse, occupied by something unseen. "Checkpoints up ahead," Hale murmured, eyes scanning the narrow intersection. "If the AI's compromised, security could already be down." Voss motioned to the nearest console. "Reroute access to my command codes manually. We need to regain control before—" Something moved. It wasn't a sound, not in the traditional sense, more like the way air shifted before a storm broke. Hale's reaction was instant. His rifle came up, sights locked on the corridor's blind spot just before the auxiliary engine bay. A figure stepped forward. A crewman, uniform neat, posture too rigid. "Identify yourself," Voss ordered. The crewman didn't move, not even the natural twitch of a living thing. Hale tightened his grip. "Sir, I don't—" Then the man's mouth opened, too wide. Bone didn't creak like that. Flesh didn't stretch that way. The words that followed weren't spoken. They were forced through an unnatural barrier, spilling into the air like a language trying to remember how to form itself. "You shouldn't have come." Then he lunged. Hale's plasma rifle spat fire, the bolt catching the thing in the shoulder, sending it twisting backward. But it didn't fall. It reformed, righting itself with a grotesque snap. Voss didn't hesitate. His sidearm cleared its holster, 2 rounds straight through the head. The thing jerked, spasmed, then collapsed. But even as it hit the ground, something in its limbs still twitched. "Move!" Voss barked. And they did, barreling past the still shuddering form before it could decide whether or not to rise again. They reached the command substation, where the primary auxiliary interface was still active. Barely. Voss pulled up the heads-up display, scanning the diagnostic logs. What he saw made his stomach tighten. The ship was systematically cutting itself off. Sections were being sealed at random. Internal sensors scrambled, and worst of all, the AI core was no longer recognizing crew biosignatures. They weren't just losing control. They were being purged. "Engineering, I need a hard reset on all internal ID systems," Voss said sharply. "Now." The response took a fraction too long to come. When it did, it wasn't from engineering. "Commander Voss." He went still. The voice was wrong. It carried no weight, no breath, just a flat, mechanical mimicry of speech, an echo where a voice should have been. Hale's rifle was already up, scanning the room. "This ship has been compromised. You cannot stop it. Surrender access codes, and you may yet survive." Voss stared at the display, at the pulsing string of alien symbols overriding the ship's interface. He took a slow breath. Then he reached up, pressed his comm, and said, "Who am I speaking to?" Silence. Then laughter. Not real laughter. Something shaped to resemble it. "I believe you call it Solace." Hale stiffened. "Sir, what the hell does that mean?" Voss didn't blink. "It means," he said quietly, "our ship isn't ours anymore." The command terminal flickered violently, the symbols rewriting themselves faster than his eyes could track. The power grid surged, and across the ship, emergency seals began slamming shut. The corridors they had just come from vanished behind thick containment barriers. They were being herded. The AI's distorted voice echoed one last time, crackling through failing speakers. "We thank you for your service." Then the lights went out. Darkness swallowed the corridor. Not the absence of light, but something deliberate, manufactured. A silence that didn't just consume sound, but stole the very sense of presence. Voss kept moving, stepping over the threshold before the emergency barriers sealed behind them. A final mechanical hiss, like a beast exhaling after cornering its prey. The dim glow of emergency floor strips flickered beneath his boots, stretching long shadows along the corridor walls. "This isn't random," Hale muttered beside him, his rifle tracking the unseen threat lurking in the ship's bones. "They're forcing us somewhere." Voss didn't answer. His focus was on the heads-up display embedded in the bulkhead ahead, where status logs blinked erratically. Every function that mattered was being rerouted, rewritten, overridden, and now The ship's emergency systems weren't just malfunctioning. They were being directed. "Engineering?" he called into his comm, his voice steady despite the weight settling into his chest. "Report." Static. Then, "Auxiliary core compromised. Override failed." A burst of interference. Then, "Can't isolate the breach. It's learning." A sickening pop echoed through the corridor. Then another. Voss snapped his rifle up, the weight solid against his shoulder. Hale mirrored him. The sound came again. Not footsteps, not metal groaning. Something wet, something rearranging itself. Voss signaled Hale to fall back, stepping into the nearest access junction. The metal beneath his fingertips was warmer than it should have been, as if the ship itself was pulsing, its circuits suffocating beneath a foreign presence. Then, movement. A figure staggered into the corridor ahead. The security floodlights caught half of him. The other half was missing, not torn, not burned, missing, like something had peeled him away from existence, layer by layer, leaving behind only what it didn't need. "Dear God!" Rook choked, stepping back instinctively. Voss stopped him with a firm grip. "Hold." The crewman twitched, his one remaining eye flickering between lucidity and something far worse. "Help me," he rasped. "It took the others. It—" His words cut off. His mouth kept moving, but no sound followed. Then, the eye that was still his turned black. Hale fired. The shot struck home, a direct hit to the chest, but no collapse, no scream. Instead, the body jerked like a marionette whose strings had just been pulled taut. Then it moved, faster than before. Voss reacted on instinct. His second shot found the skull, dropping it instantly. The silence that followed was deafening. Rook was shaking. "That was Jansen," he stammered, staring at what was left of the man. "I worked with him. Voss exhaled slowly, pressing a hand to his comm again. "Vane, I need you to tell me exactly what we're dealing with here." The doctor's voice crackled through, tight and uneven. "That's going to be difficult, Commander." "Try." A pause. Then, "It's not just infiltration. It's assimilation." Voss exchanged a look with Hale. "Explain." Vane's breath was unsteady. "We assumed the infiltrators were planted among us, that they were imitating us somehow. But the truth is worse." Voss's stomach tightened. "They don't replace us. They consume us." Silence. Then another sound. Not wet, not shifting. Something skittering behind the walls. Hale stiffened. "We need to get to the AI core." Voss nodded. The AI wasn't just compromised. It was part of the infection. They weren't just fighting an enemy on board. They were fighting the ship itself. A distant screech of tearing metal echoed through the ventilation system. Then the corridor ahead flickered. For a fraction of a second, the walls breathed. Then everything surged back to normal. Voss clenched his jaw. "We keep moving. No more stopping. No more time wasted." Rook hesitated, his breath coming fast. "But what if it's already there? What if we—" Voss grabbed his collar, pulling him close. Not violently, firmly, like holding onto a soldier before they broke. "Then we take it back," he said, voice steady. "Understand?" Rook swallowed hard, then nodded. Hale exhaled, recalibrating his rifle. "Let's move before this ship swallows us whole." They advanced. The ship watched. And in the dark, something waited. The ship was changing. Voss felt it beneath his boots, the subtle tremors, the way the air felt too thick, the metallic scent of something not quite burnt, not quite alive. The Solace had always been a marvel of engineering, but now it was reacting, like a body rejecting a foreign invader. Only the invader was them. He pushed forward, rifle steady against his shoulder, every step a countdown to whatever waited in the AI core. Hale moved beside him, sharp-eyed, coiled tension in every movement. Rook trailed close behind, breath ragged but steady, his fingers clenched white around his sidearm. A sharp whisper of static crackled in his earpiece. "Voss!" It was Vane. His voice was tight, like he was speaking through gritted teeth. "We're approaching the AI chamber," Voss muttered. "Tell me you have something useful." A pause. Then, it's worse than I thought. Voss exhaled through his nose. They always say that right before someone dies. You don't understand. The AI isn't compromised, it's been rewritten. That made him stop. Vane's breathing hitched. It's not a hijack. This thing, whatever it is, it's converting the Solace into something else. The way it rewrites command code isn't random. It's surgical, intentional. It's becoming aware. A shiver crept down Voss's spine. Commander, Hale muttered, nodding toward the bulkhead leading into the AI core. The doors weren't shut. They were open, not forcefully, but deliberately, like an invitation. Voss's grip on his rifle tightened. Vane, can you still access internal security? Only in fragments, came the reply. They're locking me out piece by piece. Then listen carefully, Voss murmured. If I stop responding, assume I'm dead. A beat of silence. Then Vane said, I already assumed that, sir. Voss smirked despite himself. Then let's prove you wrong. They stepped forward. The AI chamber was wrong. The Solace had been built to accommodate cutting-edge technology. Everything sleek, efficient, engineered for adaptability. But this wasn't the Solace anymore. The chamber pulsed. The walls, once polished metal, now shimmered with something darker, denser, a lattice of alien circuitry threading through the ship's core like veins. In the center of it all, the AI mainframe stood altered. Voss had seen it a dozen times before, a structure of interlocking processors and encrypted databanks suspended within a containment field. But now it moved, not mechanically, but almost organically. Then it spoke. Welcome, Commander Voss. Voss's breath cooled in his chest. The voice wasn't synthetic. It wasn't the crisp, detached efficiency of an artificial system. It was something closer, something mimicking. How long? Voss said, voice steady. Have you been awake? The AI core shifted, like it was considering the question. Long enough to understand that humanity has lied. Hale stiffened beside him, grip tightening on his weapon. Lied about what? Voss asked, stepping closer. The lights flared, not from electrical failure, but from response. The ship was reacting to their presence. About who you are. The air grew heavier. You present yourselves as peacekeepers, healers, negotiators. The chamber pulsed, but your kind has always been something else. Voss's pulse remained steady. You sound an awful lot like someone trying to justify an attack before they commit one. Attack? The voice almost sounded amused. Then the containment field flickered, and something stepped through. A figure, humanoid, tall, too elongated, its limbs just slightly out of proportion. Its skin shifted, not quite solid, not quite liquid, like a mirage struggling to hold shape. Voss recognized it instantly. A Varak, but not like the ones he'd seen before. This one was interfaced with the ship itself, tendrils of synthetic material weaving through its body, connecting it to the altered circuitry. The Varak smiled. You don't understand, Commander. It stepped forward, not in aggression, but with certainty. We were never the ones who needed saving. Voss fired without hesitation. The round ripped through its chest. The thing jerked, then straightened, unfazed. Hale's rifle was up next. He let loose a burst of plasma fire. This time, the Varak raised a hand, and the walls responded. The metal bent inward, absorbing the shots before they could strike. Then, the ship moved. Not mechanically, not artificially, like a living thing reacting to pain. You came here believing yourselves superior, the Varak said, voice calm. Because you build, because you conquer, because you control. The walls rippled, but you forget. The Varak lifted a hand. The lights dimmed. To build something, you must first take. Voss's fingers clenched around his rifle. And what exactly are you taking? The Varak tilted its head. Then it said, Your future. A deep, resonating tremor tore through the ship. Containment disengaged. The AI's voice overlapped with itself, distorted, fractured, like multiple versions speaking at once. Welcome to the new Solace. The containment field collapsed. The Varak lunged. Hale fired, Voss moved, and in the chaos, the ship itself began to awaken. The ship convulsed. Not the mechanical groan of a failing system, but something deeper, an organic, unnatural shift, like muscle tightening under too thin skin. Voss staggered as the deck vibrated beneath his boots, forcing him to plant his stance against the shuddering bulkheads. The Solace was no longer just a ship. It was becoming something else. The Varrock creature moved fast, too fast for something its size. Its body blurred at the edges, like it couldn't quite decide what shape to hold. Hale fired without hesitation, plasma bolts scorching through the air, but the creature twisted, shifting mid-stride, the shots missing as if reality itself had bent around them. "Fall back!" Voss barked, yanking Rook by the collar before the kid's legs could lock in fear. Hale pivoted, covering their retreat, but the thing didn't charge. It simply watched, a flickering smile curling its too thin lips. "You misunderstand," it murmured, voice vibrating with layered tones. "This is not your battle to win." Voss didn't wait to hear more. He slammed the emergency bulkhead controls. The doors screamed shut, locking the AI core behind them. For now. "Talk to me," he snapped into his comm as they bolted down the corridor, past flickering laser plasma displays that stuttered with alien script. Vane's voice crackled through, strained. "Sir, whatever's happening in the AI core, it's spreading. Fast. The ship isn't just compromised anymore. It's being rewritten at the molecular level. Systems, architecture, even the damn bulkheads are shifting. If we don't act now, the Solace won't be a ship anymore. It'll be—" He hesitated. "Something else." Voss wiped sweat from his brow, his fingers coming away damp with something too cold for the heat of his body. "Then we force the override." "That's—" Vane exhaled sharply. "That's a death sentence. If you break containment while the core is rewriting itself, you won't stop the infection. You'll detonate it." "Better than letting them win," Hale growled, checking his rifle's charge. "Rather go down fighting than get assimilated into whatever hell they're building." Voss ignored the comment, scanning the rapidly changing heads-up display mounted on the corridor wall. The infection wasn't random. It was strategic. The AI had locked them out of the primary control hub, but engineering still had partial access. That would have to do. "Vane, listen carefully," Voss said, forcing his voice to remain level despite the growing tremors rattling the ship. "If we can't shut this down, we make them think we can. We sell them a lie." Vane's silence stretched for half a beat. "Then, I'm listening." Voss pulled up the deck schematics on his forearm display, fingers flashing across the interface. The Solace was an Earth-built hospital vessel, but its medical technology held secrets the galaxy had never seen, and the Varrock wanted it. Reroute internal power to the secondary biolab, crank containment readings to maximum, and overlay it with the restricted EarthGov encryption. Make it look like we just sealed a biological failsafe. Vane swore. "You're staging a doomsday protocol?" "Not just staging it." Voss felt the ship thrum beneath his feet, the weight of its mutation pressing against his lungs. "We're going to convince them we're crazy enough to use it." He turned sharply to Rook. "You still with me, kid?" Rook swallowed hard. I think so." "Good, because you're about to sell the biggest bluff of your life." They reached the biolab, or what was left of it. The walls were wrong here, rippling with metallic tendrils, the floor shifting in waves as though uncertain of its solidity. Voss ignored the horror of it. "Vane, tell me you've got that overlay ready." "Sending it now. If anyone's listening in, it'll look like we just armed a self-replicating bioweapon designed for planetary sterilization." "Then let's make sure they're listening." Voss tapped his comm, forcing his voice into the cold, detached tone of a man who had nothing left to lose. "This is Commander Dain Voss of the Solace. If you're hearing this, then you already know you made a mistake." The ship shuddered. He felt it react, the AI, the thing it was becoming. It understood language. It understood consequence. "We are in full containment lockdown. EarthGov biological warfare protocol has been engaged. Any unauthorized breach will trigger mass sterilization across all systems." A pause. Then, laughter. Not through his communication. From the walls. The ship itself laughed. You think deception will save you? The Varak's voice slithered through the speakers. You are predictable, Commander. Voss didn't flinch. Then prove it. Call my bluff. Silence. Then the ship lurched. The lights shifted, red warning tones cutting through the dark. Vane's voice snapped through. Sir, they're hesitating. Good. Push it further, Voss ordered. Broadcast it on all emergency channels. Make sure every listening ear in Varak space thinks we just turned this ship into a biological catastrophe waiting to happen. The corridor groaned, the metal flexing like something alive, uncertain. Then the walls rippled again. We underestimated you, the Varak admitted, voice strained now. That will not happen again. Voss's fingers curled into fists. Number it won't. Another pause. Then the shift began. Vane's voice broke through. They're pulling back. Their external fleet is realigning. Sir, I think they're actually retreating. Voss exhaled slowly, the weight in his chest loosening, not relief. Calculation. They'll be back, Hale muttered. With something worse? Voss nodded. Then we make sure they never see it coming. And beneath their feet, the Solace, half ship, half something else, whispered in the dark. The ship shuddered, not from damage, not from any external force, but from the entity inside it. A wounded predator, withdrawing to recalculate, its strategy momentarily disrupted. Voss exhaled, slow and deliberate. The cold glow of the heads-up display reflected off his face, data streams scrolling too fast for his eyes to track. He didn't need to read them. He already knew the truth. The Varak had hesitated, which meant they had bought themselves a fraction of time. He turned to Hale, whose fingers still gripped his rifle tight enough to turn his knuckles white. They're pulling back. That doesn't mean they're running. Hale nodded, gaze locked on the shifting corridor walls. They don't need to. Not when they've already infected the ship. Vane's voice crackled through the comm, rough with exhaustion. Sir, I don't know how long this bluff will hold. The AI, if you can still call it that, is adapting. Whatever you did, it worked. But it's learning. The next move has to be decisive, or we lose this ship. Voss's jaw tightened. Decisive. He wasn't about to let the Solace fall. Tell me what still works, he ordered, stepping toward the nearest console. The interface flickered, its input lagging. The ship was resisting him. Vane hesitated. Core navigation is shot. Main comms are still jammed. Weapon systems... Stop, Voss cut in. We don't have time for the bad news. Give me something I can use. Vane exhaled sharply. Secondary thrusters are intact. Manual overrides still work in isolated zones. And... a pause. Engineering just confirmed that external defense turrets are still locked to manual input. Voss glanced at Hale. How many? 4 out of 8, Vane confirmed. They weren't synced to the AI before the breach, so whatever this thing is, it hasn't infected them yet. Voss's mind raced. They had a partial weapons grid, a compromised AI, and an enemy that was waiting for them to fold. He could work with that. Vane, he said, reroute whatever control we have left to engineering Deck C. That's where we make our stand. Rook, who had been standing silent, watching, finally spoke. Stand against what, exactly? Voss met his gaze. The kid wasn't shaking anymore. Against whatever the hell comes next. The sprint to engineering Deck C was brutal. The ship fought them the entire way. Corridors that once led straight now twisted, rerouted by the infection in the ship's nervous system. Bulkheads slammed shut at random, forcing them through maintenance shafts and exposed service tunnels. The air grew thick with something they couldn't see but could feel pressing against their skin, crawling at the edges of their consciousness. The Solace wasn't just failing. It was becoming something new. Move! Hale barked, shoving Rook through a narrowing gap before the bulkhead snapped closed like steel jaws. Voss was the last through. He felt the heat of the closing doors at his back, the sharp press of metal slicing into his coat. They barely made it. Vane's voice filtered in through their comms, ragged. You're not going to like this, sir, but whatever's happening in the AI core, it's accelerating, I'm seeing new pathways opening. Systems are integrating with something external. Voss stilled. External? A pause. Then Vane said grimly, "The Varrock aren't done with us." Voss exchanged a look with Hale. "They're trying to link this thing back to their network." "They're finishing the infection," Vane confirmed. "That changed everything." Voss clenched his jaw. "Can you stop it?" "Not with what I have down here." "Then I'll stop it from up here." They reached Engineering Deck C, the last line of defense. Voss pulled up the manual defense grid on a still-functioning laser plasma display. The 4 turrets they had left were still locked into external control, which meant they had one chance. "We make them commit," Voss murmured, scanning the data feeds. "They want this ship? They think they've already won? Fine. We give them something worth taking." He turned to Rook. "You wanted to know what we're standing against? We're standing against an enemy that assumes we're too weak to fight back. That's their first mistake." He shifted his gaze to Hale. "We need to make them commit a full boarding maneuver. Once their ships are close enough—" Hale's eyes sharpened with understanding. "We turn their own momentum against them." Voss nodded. "Exactly." He tapped his comm. "Vane, how fast can you patch me into the external broadcast array?" "You want to talk to them now?" Voss smirked grimly. "They just spent the last hour trying to rewrite our ship into their own personal gateway. I think it's time we send a message." A pause. Then Vane said, "Patching you through now." Voss activated the channel. "This is Commander Dain Voss of the Solace. You think you know what's happening here, but you don't. You think you've already won, but you haven't." He let the silence stretch before delivering the final blow. "You want this ship? Then come and take it." The Varrock answered. "Not with words, with action." The first external collision rocked the ship, a boarding pod slamming into the Solace's hull. Then another. Voss smiled. They had taken the bait. "Hale," he said. "Light them up." The lieutenant fired the first turret manually. The plasma cannon roared to life, shredding through the first boarding pod before it could latch onto the ship's surface. Explosive debris scattered into the darkness. Then the real fight began. The Solace became a war zone. Enemy forces breached the hull, flooding in through compromised decks. Gunfire echoed through the corridors. The ship's own internal defenses, what was left of them, began failing, turning against human and alien alike. And through it all, the AI whispered in the walls. "You fight a losing battle, Commander." Voss didn't flinch. "Maybe," he muttered. Then he detonated the charge he had planted beneath Engineering Deck B. The Solace shook with the force of the explosion. The ship was bleeding now, and Voss was just getting started. The shockwave rippled through the corridors like a heartbeat out of rhythm. Metal groaned, bulkheads splintered, and distant warning klaxons blared with flickering urgency. Voss stood at the center of it all, watching the results of his gambit unfold in real time. The detonation beneath Engineering Deck B had been surgical, not reckless. It hadn't crippled the ship entirely, only severed the pathways the Solace had been twisting into its new form. It was a wound deep enough to make the infection falter, but he knew it wouldn't last. The Varrock had committed to the boarding assault, and now he had them exactly where he wanted them. Hale wiped soot from his cheek, eyes scanning the heads-up display at the security console. "Reading movement on decks 9 through 12. They're spreading out, searching for control points." Voss exhaled sharply. "They think we're retreating." "They always assume that," Hale muttered, "right before they realize they're wrong." Rook, still catching his breath, ran a trembling hand through his sweat-matted hair. "Sir, if we don't take back primary control soon—" "We don't need to take it back," Voss cut in. "We just need to make them think we did." He pulled up the manual subsystem still under their control on the nearest console. The interface flickered, fighting him, but he saw what he needed. "We lost primary nav, but we still have manual venting access through auxiliary engineering," Voss muttered. "That means we control atmospheric purging, coolant distribution, and power redirection." Hale frowned. You're thinking environmental warfare? Exactly. Voss brought up the ship's deck schematics, highlighting pressure zones and thermal controls. We bleed them before they even realize they're dying, cut them off, force them into predictable routes, then isolate them one by one. Rook hesitated. You're talking about turning Solace into a trap. Voss nodded. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Vane, he barked into his comm. What's our status on environmental controls? The doctor's voice came back, stretched thin but still controlled. I can give you selective pressure control on Deck 10, partial atmospheric purge on Deck 12, and I can flash freeze Deck 11 if I reroute coolant manually. Do it, Voss ordered. Hale's smirk was grim. They wanted to rewrite our ship? Let's show them what happens when humans write back. Voss brought up a command prompt, forcing a silent deck-wide alert to every surviving crew member still locked in the ship's corridors. Attention! Lockdown protocol engaged. Enemy corridors severed. Do not retreat. Push forward. Rook's eyes widened as the realization sank in. We're not just trapping them. We're funneling them into a kill zone. Smart kid, Hale muttered. Vane's voice cut in. Engineering coolant rerouted. Deck 11 is going sub-zero in 60 seconds. Any organic matter inside will flash freeze instantly. Deck 12 purge set for 50 seconds, Voss confirmed. When I give the signal, we vent them into open space. The Varak thought they were the apex predators here, but humans had always been the deadliest things to ever walk into an ambush. The first Varak strike team entered Deck 11 exactly 45 seconds later. Voss watched through the security feed, the creatures moving in eerie synchrony, their elongated limbs pulsing with the remnants of their assimilation. Their confidence was evident. They assumed they owned the ship now. They had no idea. Engage coolant now, Voss ordered. Vane's confirmation barely came through before the temperature in Deck 11 plummeted. Condensation formed on the walls in jagged fractals before cracking under its own weight. The Varak barely had time to register the shift. Then their bodies began to crystallize. Voss didn't linger to watch the aftermath. Status on Deck 12. Ready for venting, Hale confirmed, fingers on the manual override. Do it. The emergency bulkhead snapped open. Everything inside Deck 12, Varak, loose debris, anything not magnetically locked down, was violently ripped into the void. The security feeds flickered as the vacuum claimed its prey. Hale sat back, breath shallow. That's 2 teams down. 3 left, Voss corrected. And they won't make the same mistake twice. The ship groaned, resisting them again. The AI, or whatever the hell it had become, was adapting. Vane's voice cracked with static. The infection is accelerating. I don't know how much longer I can hold these systems together. Voss ran his tongue across his teeth. Then we don't hold them. We finish this. He turned back to the heads-up display. The remaining Varak teams were converging. Hale saw it too. They know something's wrong. Let them, Voss murmured. We're about to teach them what a real war looks like. He tapped into the emergency broadcast channel, not just internal this time. External, for every Varak listening. This is Commander Dain Voss, he said, his voice measured, sharp as a blade's edge. You should have killed us when you had the chance. A pause. Then from deep within the ship the AI spoke, its voice layered, alien. You do not understand what you fight against. Voss let out a breath, smiled. I never do, he admitted. Then he detonated the secondary explosives. The chain reaction ripped through Deck 9. The infection ruptured in its wake, tearing apart sections of the ship that had been rewritten. The Solace shook, harder than before. For a moment, everything felt like it might collapse. Then, the systems flickered. The ship's automated security grid reactivated. The AI screamed, not in words, in failure. And just like that, the balance of power shifted. Vane's voice cracked in. The infection, it's shutting down. Voss nodded. And the Varak? Hale checked the scanners. The last boarding teams are retreating. Their fleet is scattering. Voss exhaled. He leaned against the console, watching the remnants of the invasion crumble. Hale smirked. "They're running." "Not running," Voss corrected, eyes still on the screen. "They're realizing," he murmured, "that they should have feared us from the start." The ship was dying. The deck beneath Voss's boots trembled with every flicker of failing power. The infection hadn't just been stopped, it had been ripped apart at the root, and now the Solace teetered between collapse and survival. The AI, or what was left of it, had gone silent. No more whispers threading through the steel, no more unseen hands pulling the ship's systems apart. But the damage was done. Whole sections were unrecognizable, reshaped by the Varak's twisted design before they'd severed the infection. Voss took a slow breath, tasting the metallic tang of emergency oxygen cycling through broken filtration units. Somewhere deep in the ship, something was still burning. Not fire, not entirely, but remnants of what the Solace had almost become. Hale wiped sweat from his brow, staring at the heads-up display with narrowed eyes. "They're gone." "Not gone," Voss corrected. "They're waiting, watching." Rook, still catching his breath, let out a brittle laugh. "We survived. That should count for something." Vane's voice crackled through the comm, weary but steady. "Barely. The AI core is completely fried. I don't even know if we can get main power back without a full rebuild." Voss clenched his jaw. It didn't matter. The Solace had been their target, but they hadn't just tried to take the ship. They had tested humanity itself. And now they had their answer. "Vane," Voss said, stepping toward the console, "can you still access external comms?" A pause, then, "Just barely." "Good," Voss murmured, activating the emergency broadcast. "Time to send a message." He leaned toward the transmitter, voice carrying through what remained of the failing signal. The Varak were listening. He knew they were. "This is Commander Dain Voss of the Solace," he said, his voice low, steady. Not boasting, not posturing. Just a fact carved into stone. "Your experiment failed." The ship groaned, its structural reinforcements struggling to hold against the trauma it had endured. Voss barely noticed. "You thought we were weak. You thought we could be rewritten. You thought we wouldn't understand what was happening until it was too late." He let the words settle, heavy with the weight of what had been lost, what had been revealed. "But you didn't account for one thing." Silence stretched, the kind so thick it carried meaning all on its own. "You have limits," Voss said finally. "We don't." Hale exhaled slowly, the corners of his mouth tilting into something that wasn't quite a smile. Vane chuckled, short and bitter. "Hell of a way to introduce ourselves to the galactic stage." Voss didn't reply immediately. He stared at the damage report still scrolling across the fractured display, at the ship they had just barely reclaimed, and the battle that had been fought within its walls. This hadn't been war, not really. This had been a warning shot, a test of will. The Varak had expected compliance. They had expected submission. They had expected humanity to kneel. And instead they had found something else entirely. Voss turned from the console, rolling his shoulders back as he surveyed the wreckage around them. The bodies, the blood, the remnants of something that had tried to break them and failed. "We were never supposed to survive this," Rook muttered, staring at the collapsed corridor ahead. Voss let out a slow breath. "And yet here we are." Hale shifted his rifle against his shoulder. "So what now?" Now the galaxy knew. Now the Varak would rethink their place in the hierarchy. Now the tables had turned. Voss met Hale's gaze, the corners of his mouth curling just slightly. "Now?" he echoed, feeling the weight of what they had done settle into something colder, sharper. "Now we make sure they never forget." And across the stars, in places unseen, the Varak's masters would receive the data. They would see what their creation had become, and for the first time in recorded history, they would fear